Well, it looks like you get 2 videos for the price of 1. I thought I had enough battery left in this camera to shoot an entire video without it running out, but I was wrong. So here we have the impromptu part 2 of my deck tech series featuring Nin the Paint Artist. I was in the, when we last left off, I was in the middle of talking about Ponder and why it was so good. I think I've said enough about this card, so I'm going to move on to its twin PreOrdained, which does a very, very similar effect. A little different, I suppose, in that it doesn't cause a reshuffle. But again, the flexibility of PreOrdained allows you to keep a lot of dubious hands because you're seeing 3 cards down, and opens up a wide range of other potential hands. And I think that that ability alone more than makes this card worth it. It is just tremendous compact flexibility, and is quite hard to pass up. The other thing to consider too is that one of the reasons why Ponder and PreOrdained are so good is because the kind of sketchy hands that you have where you only have 1 land, well, those hands tend to be filled with all sorts of awesome spells. So the ability to keep a 1-lander that you can feel pretty confident will develop into 2 and 3 mana relatively quickly because of PreOrdained and Ponder is really nice. It's kind of like you start the game with an extra card or 2. So PreOrdained is excellent. Along those same lines, Divining Top, very, very powerful card that belongs in many EDH decks, although not all of them. I see people actually run this card in quite a few decks that I don't think it belongs in. But that said, it's tremendously strong in the Paint Artist with all the shuffling effects. And again, allows you to keep a pretty wide range of opening hands that you ordinarily would have to throw back into in a mulligan. It's slower than PreOrdained and Ponder, but still quite strong. Just as a side note, I see a lot of people who like to use Divining Top during their upkeep before they draw, and that's almost always wrong. There are a few cases where that's correct, but don't get in the habit of doing that. I see people doing it all the time, and it's not usually wise. Oh yeah, and this card is completely nutso when combined with Future Sight, and becomes a very high priority fetch target once you have Future Sight out. Soul Ring. This is a cool beta Soul Ring from my old collection. And yeah, there isn't really a lot to say about this card, other than that it's the 2nd most powerful card in all of EDH, and is a very, very high priority fetch target, although not quite as good as Mana Crypt. This card's ban-worthy, as you all know. I talk about it all the time. Spell Pierce. Okay, this is another card that is very, very fine-tuned around the 1v1 matchup, and is another card that I cut easily when I play multiplayer. That said, the ability to go first and to counterspell an opposing Soul Ring or Mana Crypt is incredibly important, because you can just lose the game on the spot against a good deck that opens with one of those 2 cards. So having an out against that in the early game just makes it totally worth it. And a lot of people use Mental Misstep in this slot instead, figuring they can counter Soul Rings with it. And I think that there is some merit to that, but I think that the flexibility of Spell Pierce just far outweighs the ability to play the Mental Misstep on turn 0 if your opponent opens with a Soul Ring, because you face Mana Crypt just as often. Mental Misstep doesn't stop that, where Spell Pierce does if you've got a mana in play. And Spell Pierce does all sorts of other amazing things, like counterspelling turn 2 or turn 3 Jace the Mind Sculptor or Tezzeret the Seeker, or any number of incredibly powerful non-creature spells. I have countered thousands of awesome game-ending spells with Spell Pierce, and it is a very, very solid card. The problem is that in multiplayer, the very, very narrow counters like this just don't work as well, because it's hard to justify using them in a defensive position, and you're just generally dealing with way too many diverse type of threats, and generally a lot more creatures too, and Spell Pierce just doesn't handle that very well, so it comes out. Vandal Blast. The best red card in all of EDH. There's no question in my mind that this is the best red card in all of EDH. This card is absolutely insane. Tremendous flexibility because of the overload scaling, the fact that it's a single red mana to kill a turn 1 Soul Ring or a Mana Crypt, and the ability to Shatter Storm all of your opponents for 5 mana. Completely insane. And this card is an auto include. In fact, it's worth honestly running red in some decks simply because it gives you access to Vandal Blast. And in any deck that doesn't have access to this card, doesn't have access to red, you are sorely missing the effect. It is just gargantuanly powerful, allows crazy comebacks from impossible board positions where your opponent has a bunch of hexproof garbage in play. And Vandal Blast just handles it all. This card is just insane. One of my favorite cards in the game at the moment. Wayfarers Bubble. Tremendously strong fetcher. I really, really like this card because I like having things to do on turn 1. And Bauble is just one of those excellent turn 1 plays that just gets you going on the board and ramps you into 4 mana turn 3 spells and gets you ahead and just allows flexibility for mana fixing and so on. Just a great card all around. I run it, I think, in a Zami, and generally I don't run it in 3 to 4 color decks because at that point you're running so many dual lands, you don't have the ability to reliably run enough basic lands to fetch a color that you might be missing because you just don't want to be running that many basic lands in general. But in a 2-color deck, Wayfarers Bubble is awesome, as long as you're not playing Edric. Copy Artifact. All right, we moved on to the 2-mana spells. Copy Artifact, the other white bordered card I think in my deck. This card is phenomenally powerful, allows you to double up on your powerful mana-producing artifacts, like the Gilded Lotus, for example, or Thran Dynamo, and allows you to copy Veldican Shackles. And of course, more importantly, it allows you to piggyback on fast starts from your opponent, especially when you're playing multiplayer. If you begin the game with a Copy Artifact, there's a very, very good chance that you'll have access to a pretty powerful Disgusting Artifact, courtesy of your opponents if you don't have one yourself. This card is non-negotiable, at least in control decks. I don't run it in Edric because I have green creature-based Acceleration, but in the Pain Artist, this card is excellent. Counterspell, doesn't need an explanation, one of the best 2-mana counters ever printed. Yeah, I mean, they don't print cards like this anymore, right? 2-mana hard counter, hard to do better. All right, Cyclonic Rift. Another incredibly important tool that Nin, the Pain Artist, has, and this is a card that you really, really miss whenever you play a blue-based deck in a budget format where you're not allowed to use cards that cost more than $2 or whatever. Cyclonic Rift, again, that same flexibility that Vandal Blast has. It is incredibly strong, allows game-ending overload effects, and also the early flexibility of bouncing things and then countering them when they come back down. It's just, you can't really ask for more in a card for a control deck, and it allows for utterly insane blowouts in multiplayer where you rift your opponent's entire board, or all of your opponent's board, and then lock them all up under Winter Orb or something similar. And this card has tremendous synergy with a big sorcery that's in the deck, the Amnesia. So auto-include, no-brainer. Daze. This is another card which is very similar to Spell Pierce in my opinion. It's totally designed to allow you to have board presence very early in the game, starting on turn 1. It doesn't stop Mana Crypt unless your opponent is foolish enough to cast Mana Crypt before they play a land, but it does stop turn 1 Soul Ring, and I've countered hundreds of turn 1 Soul Rings with Daze over the years. You can obviously hard cast it for 2 mana, and that effect alone can sometimes be backbreaking. But the similar to the Pact of Negation, just the ability to tap out and do stuff and know that because you can generally tell when your opponent is coming up on 3 or 4 mana or whatever to cast their general, and you have a Daze in hand, you know that you can tap out to cast your Thran Dynamo or something and know that you're safe against their turn 4 Krenko or whatever, because you're just going to simply Daze it. And the cost of returning the island to your hand is relatively minor compared to the flexibility of the card. I do take this card out in multiplayer for very much the same reason, and the cost of returning an island to your hand is a lot more egregious when you're playing multiplayer. That's a lot more costly and generally not worth the cost of it. So I go with more reliable answers than Daze. But in 1v1, this card is fantastic. Felwar Stone. I love this mana producer, one of my favorite ones, and obviously tremendously powerful in multiplayer where the chances of you not being able to produce blue or red off of it are extremely low. However, even in 1v1, even if it's just a colorless mana producer, it's not that bad. And one thing that's really nice about Felwar Stones is that Nin has a lot of theft in it, courtesy of Veldican Shackles and Bribery. And because of those two effects, you often have something that requires activation in their colors, and you don't have access to those colors yourself normally without something like Gilded Lotus or Coalition Relic, and Felwar Stone gives you another out for that. And I've had crazy games where I've copied my own Felwar Stone in order to use an activated ability on something that I stole from them that required like 2 black or something crazy like that. It's pretty cool. Fire Ice. I love this card, and this is another card that is probably worth removing in multiplayer, especially because the cuts get kind of difficult and painful. It does have great flexibility, and one thing I really love about it is that it kills Gaddock Teague, which is a real nightmare for this deck to face, but it also kills a bunch of other 2 mana general or 2 toughness generals like Captain Sisay and Talrand and a few other things that have 2 health. And the ability, do not underestimate that secondary ability, the ability to tap a permanent to draw a card. I play that all the time just to cycle the card on turn 2 and to slow my opponent down, tap out their a specific colored mana producer early, tap a Soul Ring or a Mana Crypt in their upkeep, and then sometimes you just live the dream and you do things like tap a Mana Vault or a Grim Monolith with it. or you tap your own Winter Orb with it if you're playing multiplayer and get to untap all your stuff. And the flexibility of the card is tremendous, but it is probably one of those cards you could do without in multiplayer, especially if you wanted to bring in some other important tools to deal with multiple opponents. It's very good in 1v1. Grim Monolith, excellent Accelerator, again allowing for all sorts of degenerate stuff like turn 3 Amnesia or turn 3 Tezzeret the Seeker, and allowing you to ramp into the Thran Dynamo and Gilded Lotus and stuff, or get big Nin activations. Definitely worth using, and one of those irreplaceable tools at the core of the deck. Impulse, excellent card searcher card. Another card that you can opens up a wide range of keepables in the early keepable hands in the early game. And Impulse is one of those cards actually that I find I merchant scroll for quite a bit, and I've even gotten with Mystical Tutor, because it allows you to reliably get another land and gives you added flexibility in getting whatever you want. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the card, you might see that it says shuffle your library afterwards. That was a funny typo that was added to the card when they printed it, and clearly it makes no sense when you look at the first part of it, which talks about putting cards on the bottom of your library. I remember being at the pre-release way back when Visions was introduced to Magic, and everybody was very puzzled by Impulse and was following the directions where they would put the cards on the bottom and then laugh about it while they shuffled, but you don't actually shuffle. Into the Royal. This card is phenomenal and a very, very important tool in Nin. The kicker is just an added bonus, but the flexibility of being able to bounce pretty much any non-land permanent at instant speed is really, really handy. And the kicker comes into play quite a bit. And just all around, really, really nice kind of card. You just need a certain amount of tools like this. I don't use any of the ones that are devoted to bouncing creatures, things like Repulse or Rushing River. But I think that, although I guess Rushing River bounces other types of permanents. But Into the Royal handles a lot of threats and allows you to come back from difficult board states where they've got a big Planeswalker or something in play, to reset something like an Elspeth or something that's going to kill you. So I love this card. Is it Signet? This is a great Accelerator, one of the best ones in the deck. You're always very, very happy to have this card in your opening draw. Probably not quite as good as the Felwar Stone overall, and not as good as Thought Vessel, but the fact that it does give blue-red is excellent, so it's an auto-include. There it is, the Mana Drain. In my opinion, the strongest counterspell ever printed by Wizards. People argue that Force of Will is a better counterspell, and in terms of the ability to warp and change a format, I would say that Force of Will probably does have that title. But in terms of sheer power, this card is in a class of its own. There was an entire era of Magic that was completely defined by Mana Drain. It is what made control decks the best decks in Magic for many, many years, until eventually Mana Drain rotated out of whatever the topical format was. But for its time, Mana Drain allowed control decks to punish proactivity and utterly destroy people who tried to play things starting on turn 2. And I personally have Mana Drained thousands of spells and used that mana to Mind Twist and Amnesia and Time Walk, Time Twister, Giant Brain Geysers, just all sorts of crazy stuff. This card is so insane, and it's so good to have in your opening draw that you can kind of just keep it with just about anything to go with it. And it obviously has insane synergy with Nin the Pain Artist, because you can pump all the colorless mana you get from it directly into a Nin activation. And a lot of the time people write to me and they ask for not only a deck list, but they will often write back and point out a few specific cards that they don't have access to and ask me if I have suitable replacements. And the card that frequently comes up as a card that people don't have access to is Mana Drain. And one thing I always tell them is that, sure, you can build Nin the Pain Artist without Mana Drain, but you are doing yourself a disservice. It is one of the most fundamentally important tools in the entire deck. The ability to Merchant Scroll for this card early, the ability to Mystical Tutor for it, or get it with Muddle the Mixture, can completely change the way that the game unfolds. Your opponent has to take Mana Drain into account at every step of the game moving forward. And you'll often have people that are so terrified of Mana Drain sitting in your hand that instead of casting the things that actually impact the game, they'll just cast all these crappy, cheap, innocuous spells and buy you massive amounts of time to become so entrenched that they never have any hope of getting back into the game. This card it's just ridiculous. I recently actually played in a vintage tournament and learned firsthand, or it's actually not vintage, an old school tournament, old school Magic, like the 93, 94 format. And one of the things that's very common, there's a little bit of variety in terms of the rules list that people adhere to when they play in that format. But one consistent rules change, or I should say restriction, throughout that format is the restriction of mana drain. And I got to see firsthand just how different a control deck works in that era when it only has access to one mana drain. It's just completely different, not only how your deck plays, but how people can play against you. You really, really miss the ability to just mana drain things like Hymn to Torak or Hypnotic Spectre or whatever, the turn 2 sinkhole that you would normally punish your opponent for casting. But yeah, if you want to build an In the Pain artist and you want to really make the deck competitive, you got to make the investment to get mana drain. Fortunately, the Italian version of the card is only about $100. The English one is about $170 to $190, I think, for a decent condition one. Get this card. Love it, live it. All right, Mana Leak. Very, very nice little tool to have. I'm a really, really big fan of having a ramp of counters, and Mana Leak falls nicely into place there, giving you the ability to interact very quickly in the early part of the game. And most of the time, you'll be able to counter pretty much anything that's cast over the like I'd say maybe 5 to 8 turns of the game with Mana Leak, anything that's relevant. And that alone makes the card excellent. And occasionally you'll catch stuff with it later. And you can often do crazy things with it too, just forcing your opponent to make very difficult decisions, even when they have the ability to pay for the Mana Leak. But don't be afraid to Mana Leak stuff when your opponent can pay for it. There are many, many games that I've won where I basically just used Mana Leak as a mana short, where I'm playing a control war with my opponent. They cast something with 3 mana untapped, and I Mana Leak it, and they think for a long time and eventually decide that they want to pay the mana, and that opens them up to something devastating like an Amnesia or a Jace the Mind Sculptor or a Karn Liberated or any number of big game-ending bombs, Future Sight, something like that. Mana Leak is a very, very powerful tool and is another auto-include. Memory Lapse doesn't normally... This is a card I'm not actually a huge fan of in control decks because you kind of want to answer threats permanently, and this card's much more suited to a deck like Aloro or Azami. Or not Alora, I'm sorry, Edric and Azami, a deck that's more tempo-oriented where you want to get something specifically onto the board and you don't care about them redrawing the spell. It doesn't have as good a place in a pure dedicated control deck like Nin, but that said, I think it's still flexible enough and cheap enough and